if you're working for a company and you're not in a decision-making, portion of the company, you're not the person from whom, the decrees come down or whatever, where we could start integrating stuff like this. If you see your organization has kind of a lax or sloppy security culture, but you're not necessarily in a leadership position to make change, what are some things you can do to sort of improve the culture yourself, no matter where you are on the org chart?
Yeah, I mean, that's a real challenge, because a lot of people will talk about culture needs to come from the top down.
Right.
Okay. And I'm a believer that it does come from the top down, but I also believe that culture comes from the sides in and from the bottom up.
Yep. And
that's because what people often, organizations will say, this is our culture and this is what we expect. But actually, the thing that's most likely to influence people's behaviors is not necessarily what they're told is happening, but what they see immediately around them is happening. Mm-hmm. So, if you say security is important, okay, from the top, but everybody within the, everybody in the logistics function doesn't really have that view, maybe doesn't even know
the whole "it doesn't apply to me" thing.
Yeah, it doesn't apply to me, or even worse, I didn't even know what's the security. I
didn't read that email. Yeah.
so culturally, what you've got is you could go, okay, well, this isn't that important. They say it is, but it isn't, and that's what you got, like a cognitive dissonance, and that's not unusual. A lot of organizations, the top seems to say this, everyone else seems to say, hey, that's new to me. But you only have to look to organizations. Google is a great example, where actually people join that organization because of they get drawn to the culture, and when they experience that culture isn't necessarily consistent across the organization, they shout, they make their voices heard. We know that there've been a number of protests around, by Google employees, when they've gone out there and said, hey, do you know what? Your values that you say are important aren't, and I join you
here,
aren't there. So actually, there is a point to say that culture can come from across any aspect of the organization,
right?
And it's almost the point of socializing. So we know that people are very are subject to social influence. So the more they see people that they interact with behaving in a particular way, the more likely they are to see that as the acceptable norms. And most people, and I say most, okay, actually don't really want to be outsiders.
Yeah.
But it's interesting because the outsiders many people like to think that they're not part of the group or a group. They don't belong to a separate identity, but actually by the mere choice of saying I'm not part of a group, you're part of a group. It's just that group is people that don't want to be associated with that group.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. So and it's quite well established.
Yeah.
So
sure.
Yeah, I think that hopefully that sort of answers your question a little bit. And I've seen it within organizations where and I've just given you an example, Google, where people turn around and go, hey, that's not good enough. Okay. And then the board or whatever have to make decisions. The other thing, which is something, what does the board pay attention to? So if it's not going to pay attention to you, what does it pay attention to? Okay. Now, this for me is, the role of leadership, middle managers and senior managers in information security is about developing relationships where you can facilitate a discussion where you come to learn something about your customer. The board is your customer.
Right. Okay.
Okay. You give them their ideas. They say, yes, you can have the investment and our support. So in many ways, it's interesting. I sometimes ask myself, when people say the board just aren't buying into this, are we pushing the blame to the board for us not being as effective as we potentially could be in terms of, influencing them. Well, sometimes it's being realistic. I think with Kristen in the chat I had, Kristen, which you mentioned at the beginning of this chat.
Yep.
One of the things she said to me is, can you give some advice, one point of advice? And I said, well, the one thing that I would advise everybody is to realize your own vulnerability. Because often when I started off looking at the human factor, I made a lot of assumptions. And then when I did research, I realized my vulnerability was that I thought I knew something that I didn't.
Yeah.
And it can sometimes be that if your board isn't behind you, the question isn't necessarily why is the board not behind me, but what is it that I'm not necessarily doing as well as I could do? Or maybe it's just not a strength of mine. I need to speak to somebody else to get support, to understand actually what it is that the buttons that they need pressing. And maybe it could be, I know here in the UK, the Financial Services Authority has often pointed its finger towards culture and said, look, for those people that have breached, openly said they had a toxic corporate culture. I know that's happened in the US.
Yeah.
And you say to the board, how, maybe that's the point. That they say, well, I don't want my reputation damaged as the chief exec. And you say, well, an incident's going to happen. And this is the sort of feedback we're getting back from, the Senate committees when they interview chief execs following an incident, and they talk about culture. So where do you want to be as the chief exec if you have to stand or sit in front of the Senate committee?
New episodes of Cyberwork are available every Monday at 1 p.m. Central. And don't forget to claim your free month of InfoSec skills. Sign up using the code CYBERWORK and you'll get unlimited access to hundreds of courses, hands-on labs, certification practice exams, skills assessments, and more. Use code CYBERWORK for InfoSec skills.